In Western Europe, in the decade of 1910, the World War began in 1914 with the killing of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Germany intervened as an ally of Austria-Hungary. The enslavement plan was developed by the Germans. The United Kingdom declared war to Germany, while Germany declared war to Russia and France. They fought the Marne battle with the French army, when there was a trench warfare statement. This didn't benefit either. The French managed to get the victory. Meanwhile, on the East Coast versus the Russian in the Tannenberg battle, which was a major victory of the Germans, Italy started as an ally of the Central Powers, but in 1915 declared to switch sides. Also, in 1915, Germany started an unrestricted submarine war. In 1917, England managed to help Lawrence of Arabia take Gallipoli to defeat the Ottoman Empire. The Germans were defeated in the Second Battle of Marne in 1918. Ludendorff called for the truce. In the late November of 1918, the Germans founded the Weimar Republic. Austria-Hungary separated. War ended with the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, and Orozco and Villa mobilized armies. Meanwhile, Zapata waged a bloody campaign starting in 1911. Ciudad Juárez was taken. In that same age, Madero was declared president. In 1913 came the end of Madero's presidency with the 10 tragic days, where Diaz and Huerta signed the Pact of Embassy. Huerta became president in 1914. Later, in the Plan of Guadalupe, Villa and Obregón took Huerta into exile. In 1915, Villa and Zapata, and Carranza and Madero fought in the Celaya battle where Villa and Zapata were defeated, which later on, because of the last battle, Carranza assumed presidency and signed the Constitution. The U.S.-Louisiana boat sank, which made the U.S. enter to World War I, and after all the conflicts, the armistice ending the World War I was signed. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan took control of Korea in 1910. In 1911, the Chinese Revolution started when Sun Yat-sen created the Movement of National Party. Then, Chiang Kai was elected president. In 1914, Russia entered World War I. In 1917, the Russian Revolution and the Civil War between the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks occurred. Also, in 1919, Poland was created from the German Empire. The First Balkan War happened in 1912, at the same time that Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. In 1915, Bulgaria joined Central Powers and Serbia was eliminated from World War I. 3 years later, in 1919, Yugoslavia was created. Germany was paying all the damages that they caused during World War I. Totalitarian governments started rising. In 1922, Mussolini formed a new Italian government. The world fell to crisis, and in 1929, there was a huge economic problem worldwide. Lenin's new economic policy in 1921, Lenin's death in 1924, they became Stalin as a dictator, and the creation of the first five-year plan in 1928. The Communist War was from 1927 to 1932 between Mao Zedong in Guangdong versus nationalism. In 1929, the US market crashed, and this caused the Great Depression. The totalitarian governments began to rise in Russia, death of Stalin, in Germany with Hitler, in Italy with Benito Mussolini, in Spain with Franco, and in Japan with Hirohito as an emperor. In 1939, Italy invaded Ethiopia. In 1936, Germany and Italy sent troops to Spain. As Germany and Italy have common interests, they formed the Rome-Berlin Axis. In 1939, Hitler's violations to the Treaty of Versailles were evident. He also annexed Czechoslovakia and asked for the port of Danzig. He grew his army and invaded Poland, which caused France and UK to stop their policy of appeasement and declare war. In 1928, Germany took Sudetenland, while in the USSR in 1934, the Soviet Union joined the League of Nations. 2 years later, Leon Trotsky plots against Stalin but fails, and in 1939, Stalin signed the Non-Aggression Pact with Hitler. While in Poland, between 1938 and 1939, Hitler demanded Poland lands, and together with Stalin, he invaded Poland. Germany created an alliance with Hungary. The US declared war on Japan, and the Allies invaded France on the D-Day in the age of 1939. Japan invaded Manchuria with the excuse of the Monkey Incident in 1931. Later on, Japan left the League of Nations. Then, Japan declared war on China in 1937, creating the Nanjing Raid. In 1937 was the rape of Nanjing. Later that year was the Japanese Rebellion.
Bueno, el milagro mexicano es una época en la que México logró sobrepasar los estándares que estaban alineados, por así decirlo, en toda América Latina. A consecuencia de la Guerra Fría y a consecuencia de los problemas económicos y debacle de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, la mayoría de los países van a enfrentar situaciones terribles. México lo que va a hacer encerrarse, va a hacer sustituir las importaciones, va a procurar que las empresas mexicanas sean las que tengan la mayor importancia, va a aumentar los aranceles a los productos extranjeros de tal manera que va a cimentar y va a fortalecer la economía interna. Va a ser un momento clave para que México pueda mantener una paridad con el dólar, va a mantener el precio por 30 años y va a estar procurando que el país en general pueda fortalecerse. A diferencia de otros países de América Latina que estaban teniendo revoluciones, que estaban teniendo conflictos bélicos muy fuertes y muchas veces influenciados por el comunismo y por la situación de la Guerra Fría y el capitalismo, México va a ser un estandarte y va a ser un ejemplo, y de tal manera se le conoce como el milagro mexicano, que un país de América Latina pudiera estar experimentando un momento clave de la economía.
Hitler's Germany continued with the Blitzkrieg attacks over Europe.
When it comes to World War II, I think my country, the Netherlands, was very well affected. My grandparents, like my whole family, survived the war because we lived 1 minute from the border. The Germans actually took over immediately. It really devastated Europe. He said exactly what he needed to say to make the people like him, and I can't believe that something like this actually happened. It was something very bad, very devastating, that really reshaped the way we see Europe today.
Winston Churchill became Prime Minister in the UK. Germany took Paris and France by the beginning of war, but England managed to keep stable in the Battle of Britain. Mussolini and Hitler stick together and tried to spread fascism. The first major victory of the Allies occurred in Tunisia in the year of 1943. For the victory in Tunisia, the Allies continued escalating zones and managed to take Sicily. Hitler couldn't manage he being killed, so he decided to suicide, while Mussolini was captured and shot. Germany was evident with the Berlin Wall. The USSR was invaded by Germans, the Soviets took Ukraine, and they also divided Korea with the US in 1949. USSR created the Comecon and the atomic bombs. While in Poland, the Soviets took Poland in 1945. 2 years later, it became communist, and the Polish forces took Warsaw, but then the Germans recaptured it. Bulgaria joined the Axis in 1940. Italy tried to invade Greece but failed. Germany achieved invading Yugoslavia in 1941. The US sanctioned Japan because of the invasion of Indochina, and after that, the NATO was established. A year later, US Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan. In 1943, the Third Conference was created. Many conferences happened in 1945, such as the Jalta Conference, which divided the whole world between Soviet and Western influence. The San Francisco Conference, where the UN was officially created, and Potsdam Conference, in which the US looked for free elections in Eastern Europe. 2 years later, in 1947, the Truman Doctrine, in which the United States will provide money to countries that were threatened by communist expansion. The Marshall Plan happened in the same year. Japan allied with Germany and Italy during World War II in 1940. In 1945, Iwo Jima and Okinawa were in the American power as Cape bases in Japan. The nuclear bombs were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, making Japan to surrender, and Japan's rule over Korea ended. The Vietnam War started, and in 1954, the Geneva Peace Accords was signed by France and Vietnam in the summer divided Vietnam in parallel 17. In 1949, the Communists won People's Republic of China, which marked the start of the golden years until 1957. In 1954, French and Indochina War ended. In 1955, Austria and Italy joined the UN. Germany Federal Republic joined NATO. During the 1950s, in Czechoslovakia, leading communist figures were killed and Anthony Novotny became president. The USSR helped North Korea in 1950. 5 years later, Nikita Khrushchev became leader of the Warsaw Pact. A year following this event, while all of this happened, Poland joined the Warsaw Pact, Yugoslavia signed military agreement with the US, and Greece joined NATO. Fidel Castro began his leadership in 1953. He attacked the Moncada barracks. 3 years later, 1956, the guerrilla warfare took place. In 1959, Cuba became the first communist state. Japan became the principal source of supplies of the UN during the Korean War and increased their economy in 1950. Then, from 1958 to 1965 was a great leap forward. During 1950, Ho Chi Minh proclaims the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. North Korea crosses the 38th parallel. In 1953, Korea made the peace treaties, and the 38th parallel resets between Communist North and Anti-Communist South. The Geneva Accords in 1954 declares a ceasefire and divided Vietnam officially into North Vietnam and South Vietnam. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was built, dividing Germany.
The Cold War is the name given to the relationship that developed primarily between the USA and the USSR after World War II. The Cold War was to dominate international affairs for decades, and many major crises occurred. For many, the growth in the weapons of mass destruction was the most worrying issue. The real cause of the Cold War was the difference in ideology between these two major countries, capitalism versus communism. The world changed after the World War II from a multipolar system to a bipolar system dominated by these two powers. After war, both sides distrusted each other. They raced in many ways, but never fought directly because of their fear for a huge mass destruction caused by their nuclear weapons. These powers involved themselves in many proxy wars, always with the excuse of protecting democracy and freedom, and by the other side, defending communism and equality. Yes, a war with benefits, but also fatal and unnecessary casualties, which shall never be forgotten.
In the USSR, in 1961, the creation of the Berlin Wall, the US implemented an economic embargo against Cuba in 1960. A year later, the US sent troops to the Bay of Pigs in Cuba, and in 1962, Russia invaded Cuba with missiles and created the Cuban Missile Crisis conflict in 1962. In 1961, John F. Kennedy released the white paper Resolution for Vietnam. Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas at the age of 1963. Gulf of Tonkin incident, in which an American warship is bombed, happened a year later. Nixon won elections to stop war. The Chinese Cultural Revolution was from 1966 until 1976. Vietnam, in 1960, formed the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong. And in 1964, North Vietnam attacked the U.S. Navy at the Gulf of Tonkin, and in 1965 and 1968. Nixon reached an agreement with North Vietnam in the Paris Peace Accords. In 1973, the U.S. left Vietnam. Later, the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon fell to the North Vietnamese, ending the Vietnam War. In Czechoslovakia, in 1975, Gustav Husak became president. In USSR, in 1977, Lenin Brezhnev becomes president. In 1989 occurred the fall of the Berlin Wall, which ended officially the Soviet Union and ending the Cold War II. In Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Revolution, mass protests caused abolishment of communist constitutional hold on power in 1989. In the USSR, the starting of the reforms, signaling near end of communism. While in Poland, in 1981, martial law began.